Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time and your time zone. My name is David Mays, and I'm a professor of civil engineering in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Colorado, Denver, here in beautiful Denver, Colorado, USA. In this video, I would like to share some ideas about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes abbreviated DEI. In particular, I would like to focus on how teams with diversity, equity, and inclusion lead to better outcomes. You may be asking, why would a civil engineering professor make a video about diversity? Shouldn't engineers defer to experts in other fields like sociology? On the one hand, you're right. I certainly defer to my colleagues whose work allows them to call themselves diversity experts. But on the other hand, if you want to be a good engineer, you need to develop an appreciation for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is because engineering is not just about mathematics and science and economics. It is definitely about all those things, for sure. But those things are not our basic calling. Our basic calling is to advance the health, safety, and welfare of the public, where I am quoting from the Code of Ethics of my professional organization, the American Society of Civil Engineers. Every engineering organization has a similar statement, whether you're in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, anything. In fact, my organization's code of ethics is even more specific. In their ethical canon 1F, it states to treat all persons with respect, dignity, and fairness, and reject all forms of discrimination and harassment. I argue that the opposite of discrimination and harassment is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's fundamental to what we do as engineers working to serve the public. Okay, so that's why I'm focusing on diversity. But you may still ask, why the focus on teams? Good question. I am focusing on teams because that is how we work. Sometimes we work with other engineers from our own discipline. So in my case, that would be with other civil engineers. Other times we work with engineers from other disciplines. Sometimes our colleagues are scientists. For example, when we work with geologists who help us design dams, or when we work with analytical chemists who check if our water treatment processes are working properly. Sometimes we work with teammates in business, sometimes elected officials, and sometimes with general members of the public. The days when an engineer would spend most of their time alone in a cubicle are mostly over. And believe me, that's a good thing, because most of that time was traditionally spent doing tedious, repetitive tasks that we now handle with computing. The thing that makes us engineers professionals, as in any other profession, is the application of judgment to solve open-ended problems. We have to bring not just our brains, but our hearts and our souls to work because, as I mentioned before, it's not about us. We are answering a higher calling. And in 2021, many of the basic problems in engineering have been solved. What we work on these days is challenging problems that cannot be solved by anyone working alone. It's not like your homework from Physics 1 and Physics 2. This is why teamwork is fundamental to engineering, and why teaching teamwork is part of any engineering program under the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology, or ABET for short. In fact, their Student Outcome 5 requires engineering graduates to demonstrate, and I quote, an ability to function effectively on a team whose members together provide leadership, create a collaborative and inclusive environment, establish goals, plan tasks, and meet objectives. By the way, did you notice that accreditation requirement called for a collaborative and inclusive environment? We're back to equity and inclusion. Before going any farther, I better define the key terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here is how they are defined according to extension.org, and I quote, diversity is the presence of differences that may include race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status, language, disability, age, religious commitment, or political perspective. Equity is promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness within the procedures, processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. Inclusion is an outcome to ensure those that are diverse actually feel and or are welcome. Inclusion outcomes are met when you, your institution, and your program are truly inviting to all. In my opinion, there is a strong and legitimate social justice motivation for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Happily, this opinion matches my employer's strategic priority to create a more cohesive, collaborative, and inclusive culture on our campus in downtown Denver. The key point I want to highlight here is this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a win-win. I am not calling for DEI at the expense of other things, quite the opposite. Over the last 10 years, we have seen a growing body of evidence that diversity, equity, and inclusion help teams achieve more. Here's how the rest of this video will proceed. First, I will review the evidence for the win-win. Then I will dig in a little more to explain why this happens. You'll see. Let me break the evidence for the win-win into two realms, business and academics. A great deal of the research on diverse teams has been done by our colleagues in business, and it's a legitimate source because engineering is a business after all, and because business is one of the three pillars of sustainability, along with labor and environment. Let's see what they have to say. One of the most highly cited business reports comes from the management consulting firm McKinsey. Back in 2015, they identified a correlation between the identities of the people on a company's corporate board and its profitability. And what they found is pretty profound. They found that gender diverse companies were 15% more likely to have above median earnings. And even more impressively, ethnically diverse teams were 35% more likely to have above median earnings. 5 years later, in 2020, they released a follow-up study that showed that companies whose executive teams were in the top quartile of gender diversity were now 25% more likely to experience above average profitability compared to peer companies in the fourth quartile. A 10% gain in just 5 years, although still less than the 36% bonus for ethnically diverse companies. These impressive results have been confirmed by others. For example, the Swiss-based World Economic Forum reports that diverse companies are 25 to 36% more likely to outperform on profitability and enjoy up to 20% higher rates of innovation. A few minutes ago, I promised to also share some results on academics, which will be important if you are now or are hoping to become an engineering professor who is expected to publish. First, back in 2014, Freeman and Huang reported in the journal Nature that academic papers by multi-ethnic teams get 5 to 10% more citations, which is one of the major metrics for research impact. Second, University of Michigan professor Scott Page reported a study by others that looked at 22 million research papers. Other things being equal, having co-authors teaching at different schools made the papers 8 to 10% more likely to earn the coveted designation of highly cited, which they defined as getting at least 100 citations. Actually, that's a pretty good improvement for a pretty specific example of diversity. These impressive results suggest the next question: how does diversity help the bottom line? Here's a pithy answer from Columbia University professor Catherine Phillips, quoted in Forbes magazine. Diversity jolts us into cognitive action in ways that homogeneity simply does not. So the key thing is cognitive action. To explore that a little more deeply, let's revisit our previous definition of diversity. The multinational business school, INSEAD, distinguishes different kinds of diversity, and I quote, identity diversity. This includes the visible demographic categorizations that have traditionally been used to describe diversity, such as gender, ethnic background, religious belief, sexual preference, nationality, and age. Cognitive diversity, diversity of knowledge, experience, perspectives, or ways of tackling problems. INSEAD argues that cognitive diversity, avoiding the trap of like-minded groupthink, is the essential ingredient leading to better team outcomes. Remember University of Michigan professor Scott Page? He has published a number of books that also point to cognitive diversity as the key ingredient leading to what he called a diversity bonus. So the next question is, what is the source of cognitive diversity? You can certainly get cognitive diversity from a group of people who look alike. Think about your own family. They may all look alike, but most likely they do not agree on everything, which is what makes family gatherings so interesting. That is cognitive diversity. But here is the essential symbiosis between these two kinds of diversity. People with identity diversity are more likely to have cognitive diversity. This is because people with different gender, race, and so on have different life experiences. Those different life experiences provide a foundation for different perspectives. It's certainly not a guarantee. You could have two people who look quite different but went to the same school with the same advisor, end up with similar sets of skills and perspectives. But different life experiences lead to cognitive diversity, and that makes teams work better. By the way, this also affirms your life experience in case you have taken a path that may not resemble the traditional path into an engineering career. Your path is your strength. And this is one of the best things about CU Denver, where we have students from all kinds of life experience. Now, getting back to engineering teams, let's break down some of the benefits of cognitive diversity. Back in 2013, Hewitt and co-authors, writing in the journal Harvard Business Review, defined two-dimensional, or TUD, diversity as combining identity diversity and cognitive diversity. They found that companies with 2D diverse leadership were 45% more likely to grow market share and 70% more likely to capture new market. Why? In 2020, Levine, writing in Forbes magazine, noted that women either directly make up or influence up to 80% of all purchases, which is consistent with the observation that companies with gender-balanced teams have a higher return on equity. Levine also reported that when at least one member shares a client's ethnicity, the team is more than twice as likely to understand that client's needs. Understanding your client's needs is very much the essence of engineering. Here's yet another perspective, this time from the Swiss-based World Economic Forum. They reported that diverse teams make better decisions in part because they have up to 30% greater ability of spotting and reducing business risks. Sometimes you need a different perspective to understand why a certain design may be culturally inappropriate and therefore a bad idea. Remember Professor Phillips from Columbia University? She has done some really interesting research comparing identity diverse groups with homogeneous groups. Her work has confirmed the diversity bonus, but she went deeper because she explained why. Why diverse groups work, or at least part of why diverse groups work, is that people prepare better and listen better when they work with people different from themselves. This is true whether the difference is between Black and white people or between Democrats and Republicans. And for you academic engineers out there, remember that study about multi-ethnic teams getting 5 to 10% more citations? Freeman and Huang reckon that bonus stems from two things. First, they suspect multi-ethnic teams gain from better cognitive diversity. They also reckon that multi-ethnic teams have broader social networks and professional networks, which also helps their shared research gain more visibility and thus more citations. Both are good reasons to collaborate outside your own identity group. So what have we learned from this brief distillation of the research? Diversity helps teams. Cognitive diversity generates more and better ideas. And identity diversity fuels cognitive diversity. But what about equity and inclusion? Shouldn't we talk about them too? Yes, absolutely. Because diversity does not work without them. To quote the multinational business school in Seed, it is not easy to work in a diverse team or organization. This concept is illustrated by the following sketch from the Korn Ferry Institute. In the short run, a diverse team may be less productive, but in the long run, Scott Page's diversity bonus provides a fundamental advantage. To once again quote Levine writing in Forbes, differences among team members force each person to anticipate that there will be alternative and unexpected viewpoints to consider and evaluate. Reaching consensus will take more effort. People must work harder to communicate their own thinking, and they need to broaden their own views to consider unexpected perspectives of others. This takes more work and preparation, but it's significantly valuable. You may be wondering, why would I bring this up? Isn't the point of this video to promote diversity? Yes, it is, but I want it to work. And besides, if you're an engineer, you probably didn't choose that path because you thought it would be easy. Obviously, I cannot speak for all engineers, but in my experience, engineers are not intimidated by a little challenge. Another way to frame this is the diversity, both identity diversity and cognitive diversity, is necessary but not sufficient. To be successful, diverse teams, or any teams, need anyone on the team to feel they are being treated fairly, equity, and that their ideas, concerns, point of view, sense of humor, and so on are recognized and valued. Inclusion. Earlier in the video, I mentioned 2 reports by the management consulting firm McKinsey, the second of which offers 5 specific suggestions to make sure the diversity bonus really works. And I quote, 1, ensure representation of diverse talent. 2, strengthen leadership accountability and capability for inclusion and diversity. 3, enable equality of opportunity through fairness and transparency. 4, promote openness and tackle microaggressions. 5, foster belonging through unequivocal support for multivariate diversity. And this leads us back to our basic premise of a win-win. Why? Because the World Economic Forum reports that positive employee engagement generates a statistically significant causal relationship to employee retention. Not just for those who identify along one or more dimensions of identity diversity, but for all employees. A win-win. Sounds like good engineering. To wrap up, I would like to take a few minutes to acknowledge that this video was prepared in Denver, Colorado, on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute. I would also like to acknowledge financial support from the U.S. National Science Foundation through awards 174, 2603, and 174, 4524. I would like to thank the team at the Comcast Media and Technology Center for video production. And finally, I would like to acknowledge assistance from Martin Dunn, Catherine Goodman, Lindsay Hamilton, Timberly Rohn, and Jessica Romero at the University of Colorado, Denver, and from Sarah B., Monica Beal, Carol Fletcher, Teresa Murad, and Daniela Sacedo at the Includes National Network. I could not have made this video without their help. But having said that, my opinions and any errors and omissions are my own, rather than my colleagues, employers, or sponsors. Thank you for your interest in this video. Now, let's go do our best engineering together.